Giovanni Botero, born in Italy in 1544, joined the Society of Jesuits in his youth, but was never allowed to take his final vows. Instead, he spent his life teaching philosophy and rhetoric at Jesuit colleges from Paris to Rome, and as a tutor to the sons of powerful political leaders of Italian city-states. His political philosophy, informed by Catholic theology, offers a counterpoint to the more amoral advice of scholars like Machiavelli. You will see this even in the short excerpt we are reading from his book on the greatness of cities, written in 1588, as he stresses the practical importance of justice based on laws rather than ruthlessly opportunistic exercise of power whenever possible. This article is important because the virtues described by Botero directly foreshadow the most important features of Malthus's principles of population. Reading Giovanni Botero's essay on the greatness of cities, one of the first things you might wonder is, why cities? In the 21st century, we may think of cities as great or not so great places to live, as larger or smaller in area or population, but greatness is rarely the first feature of a city that we would mention. We're more likely to think of a nation or country as great, as a power on the world stage. But Botero was writing some 4 centuries ago, during a period when nation-states as we know them today hadn't even begun to appear on the world map. He lived in an age when cities, great and small, served as the power centers or political building blocks of the day. His was the age of the city-state rather than the nation-state. So of course he was interested, just like his contemporary Niccolo Machiavelli, in giving political advice to the rulers of these city-states about the best way to make their cities great. During the heyday of little city-states scattered over the map of Europe, when anyone started thinking about greatness, the first thing that naturally would spring to mind was the former glory of the Roman Empire. For a couple of thousand years before Botero's time, first the Roman Republic, later the Roman Empire, and eventually its successor, the Byzantine Empire, had ruled over a huge territory almost the size of the contemporary United States. A Roman citizen could travel from the Pillars of Hercules, as they used to call the Strait of Gibraltar, to the rivers of India, from the Sahara Desert in Africa to the Rhine River cutting through the middle of Europe, communicating with people everywhere in the Latin language, and enjoying the rights and privileges of the Roman universal state. If that wasn't greatness, then what was? So when Botero starts his essay by talking about Rome, he would be sure to strike a chord of familiarity and agreement with his audience in the 1600s. Nothing in their day was as great as Rome once had been. From this familiar starting point, he asks his basic question: what made the Roman Empire so strong? Certainly they had large, well-disciplined armies, with Roman legions marching all over the place and conquering one enemy after another. But Botero points out that the Romans often lost huge numbers of their legionnaires in battles, sometimes more than the losses of their enemies, and still in the long run they triumphed. So he traces their enduring strength not to the armies themselves, but to the population that furnished a constant reservoir of replacements to fill the ranks whenever hundreds or thousands of them were lost in combat. This idea of strength in numbers is his most fundamental point about what made a city-state great in those days. In contrast to this greatness of Rome, he then goes on to point out that some other more recent cities, even more familiar to his readers in those days, never quite managed to match the greatness of Rome. He observes that neither Milan nor Venice, the local superpowers of the Italian city-states, came anywhere close to the population size or territorial extent of the Roman Empire that came before them. Why not, he asks. In fact, he even points out that eventually even Rome itself also stopped growing. For several centuries, the Eternal City kept expanding, covering more territory and growing in population, but eventually even Rome reached an upper limit of population and grew no larger. So he really has 2 questions, not just one. First, What explains why a city grows bigger and more powerful? And second, what explains why at some point it stops growing, reaching some kind of limit? What sort of limit was involved in this case? Since Botero lived in an age when the Holy Roman Catholic Church ruled over every one of these city-states for hundreds of miles in every direction, Botero must take a little detour before he goes much further with his essay. He has to make the same reflexive bow toward the Pope and the Church that every learned scholar of that day took care to remember, since the Church's thought police would certainly read every word he wrote and would be on the lookout for anything that might be out of line with Catholic doctrine. So his immediate first answer about why each city grew as it did, and why each city stopped at some certain size, different for each city, was that, of course, that was the way God wanted it to be. God always gets what he wants. If he wants Rome to be huge and great, it will be. If he wants some other city to be small and weak, so be it. With the bowing out of the way, however, Botero ventures on a little further. Assuming that God wants a city to be great, he wonders, how is the thing managed? That is, what are the tools or mechanisms approved by the Almighty to make these things come out as he wants them? There must be some processes involved that we can study and be ready to imitate if the chance comes along. Once he gets over this hurdle, Botero can introduce us to his two most fundamental insights or principles. He declares that there are two factors that determine a city's growth and also its eventual limits to growth. The fact that he calls both of these factors virtues shows us very clearly that he thinks of population growth as a good thing, a sign of God's favor and the mark of a potentially great city-state. He's one of a long lineage of scholars sometimes called populationists, who regard more population as better, not as any kind of social problem. Populationists appear in every time and place, including our own, and Botero is one of their intellectual ancestors. The first virtue he calls the virtue generative. This is his polite 1600 way of saying that we human beings are very fond of making babies, and that we will do this as much as possible every chance we get. To put it bluntly, we are one horny species. Every tribe and community of humans always has this potential to make lots of babies and to increase the population, according to Botero. But there are two sides to Botero's coin of human virtues. Once people have been produced by our virtue generative, we still have to sustain them over the course of their lives. In particular, Botero points out that no matter how societies may change over the course of history, people always will have to eat. What they eat depends on where they live, in particular on what he calls the virtue nutritive of their society. The deciding factor in the greatness of every city or country boils down to variations in this other virtue, the virtue nutritive. After you respond to a few questions about Botero's ideas, we will have a closer look at how he sees these variations in the virtue nutritive working out and what he thinks determines how that happens differently in different times and places. To understand how the two human virtues named by Botero interact in ordinary human life, we have to pay attention first of all to how he explains them, that is, where he says they come from. On one side of this coin of virtues, then, we see the virtue generative that leads to us making babies whenever we get the chance. This is not something we stop and think out logically. It is not imposed on us by decisions of some king or bishop or politician. The virtue generative is hardwired right into the human species. We never really needed any advice to be fruitful and multiply. It's just what we do. When we look carefully at this virtue generative described by Botero, we see that he treats it as a universal constant of human life, a built-in force of human nature. According to him, we never have to worry about it. Our basic nature provides an unfailing wellspring of population growth. The virtue generative is as natural and reliable as the force of gravity, though of course Botero hadn't heard about the theory of gravity yet. As he puts it, quote, "As apt are men in these days for generation as they were in the times of David or Moses," unquote. Botero is speaking to a long-ago Catholic world. When he refers to figures from the Old Testament, he again strikes a chord with his readers and listeners everywhere in his world of that day. They all know who he is talking about, and they know that those days were a long time ago. They also were familiar with all the begetting that is chronicled in the Old Testament, so they can easily accept Botero's declaration that the human race has always been good at reproducing, and that we continue to be good at it right down to the present. The virtue generative is what we would call a constant of human life, not a variable. Now, everybody who has studied any math or logic knows that you can't explain a variable using a constant. So if the growth rate of population has varied from one city to another, and has even varied for any particular city from one time period to another, then this constant factor of the virtue generative can't be the explanation for such changes and differences. This is where his other virtue comes into play. When we turn to the virtue nutritive, otherwise known as the problem of getting enough to eat and stay alive, things in Botero's picture of life quickly become very different. First of all, he observes that the ability of a social group to provide a reliable, plentiful food supply for its members most certainly is not some kind of eternal principle of human nature. It varies from one city-state to another. In one case, the virtue nutritive might be so strong that the people in a particular place can grow into a numerous, powerful city-state like Rome itself. In others, not so much. Whatever this power may be, that is what sets the upper bound on how big a city can grow, on how great it can become. So this variable factor of the virtue nutritive is the key to understanding the greatness of cities. The more virtuous a city is in this sense, the bigger and more powerful it will be. All Botero has to do, once he has set up this balance between the constant wellspring of people flowing from the virtue generative and the variable limits to growth that come from different levels of the virtue nutritive, is to explain to the rulers of his local city-states how to get the most virtue nutritive out of your situation, and hopefully become a powerful prince of a great city in the process. Boiled down to its fundamentals, Botero's answer to this problem is the opposite of his declaration that the first virtue comes from our built-in human natures. Instead, the second virtue of being able to produce enough food for your city comes from the details of social organization, from how effectively people can work together to get this critical job done. He illustrates the complexity of social organization required to sustain a great city by pointing out that to feed a huge population like that of Rome, or even the people of contemporary cities like Venice, Milan, or Genoa, you could no longer just rely on a few farmers outside the edges of the city. Food imports to keep a great city going had to come from all points of the compass. This is one of the fundamental reasons why the Romans built the famous roads that all led to Rome, so that carts full of food could be rolling along them all the time. Botero adds that if you look out into the harbor of such a city, you would see ships with which, quote, merchants transport corn from India or Cathay to Rome, unquote, to feed its masses. By corn, of course, a European like Botero meant what an American would call wheat. What Americans call corn, he would have called maize instead, and in the 1600s that would still have been something of a novelty crop. His point is a simple one. It takes a complex division of labor with people specialized in trade, transportation, irrigation, and all kinds of other specialties beyond simple farming itself to keep a great city fed. It takes social organization. The better your organization, the bigger your city can grow. The more inefficient or primitive your social organization, the smaller your city will be, if you can even manage to live in a city at all instead of roaming through the forest somewhere. To highlight this contrast with what he regarded as inferior forms of social organization, Botero explicitly drew attention to such opposite situations in other parts of the world, where some people, as he put it, quote, go to the hunting and chase of men, as we of hearts or hares, feeding themselves with their flesh. They dismember and devour children and living infants, unquote. These rumors of cannibalism in the New World have been challenged by some anthropologists, but Botero's basic claim that they lacked the social organization to produce a better food supply is still logically correct. Others, like, quote, the people of Guinea enforced by poverty, do at a base low price daily sell their children to the Moors, unquote. Similarly to, quote, the people of Peru, who for little or nothing give their children to any will have them, which certainly proceeds from their misery and inability to feed and maintain them, unquote. There is no avoiding the judgmental tone in these references by Botero. Any society that cannot feed its people, in his view, lacks virtue, in particular the virtue nutritive. Any society that is able to feed and maintain a large and growing population, in his view, gives direct evidence of its greater virtue, again, the virtue nutritive. We could not ask for a plainer statement of populationism, of the doctrine that population growth is a direct sign of social and personal virtue in that population. After you consider the next questions about his article, we will focus on his exact recipe for how to achieve such a virtuous outcome for your own city-state. True that at some points in his essay, Giovanni Botero does mention some possible negative side effects of population growth. That troublesome virtue generative, after all, is always busy encouraging us to make more babies, and sometimes that can produce problems. For example, Botero mentions social conflict among people over resources, especially including food. Where there are too many hungry people, he says, plagues and diseases can break out because the people are weakened and vulnerable, an observation that we can still repeat in our world today. As he puts it, quote, there is not anything for which men fight more furiously than for territory, food, and convenience of habitation, unquote. Botero also mentions another pattern that appears again and again in history when populations began to overflow the limits of their supplies. The Romans, he says, quote, made choice of many poor citizens and sent them into colonies, where, like trees transplanted, they might better their estates, live more commodiously, and so might multiply, unquote. In the same way, Greek city-states also scattered colonies out of themselves all over the Mediterranean world and up along the shores of the Black Sea, where people can still observe the ancient ruins of Greek settlements today, far away from Greece itself, the demographic seeds that guaranteed that we still discuss and remember Greek philosophy and literature today. Another variation on this theme of exporting the extra people happened over and over again as waves of people from the successive tribes dominating Central Asia came pouring from the east into Europe over the past couple of thousand years, from the Goths and the Avars to the Mongols and the Huns. All of these various strands of history find their origin in the mismatch of Botero's two virtues, the virtue generative pitted against the virtue nutritive. But in pointing out such problems arising from population pressure, Botero in no way is criticizing the virtue generative itself, that it is not a virtue after all, but some kind of flaw or bad side of human nature. On the contrary, making babies always remains a virtue in Botero's eyes. The problem comes from the social organization side, when a society can't put together the social rules and relationships needed to get people working together, producing enough food for everyone. The problem comes from a lack of the virtue nutritive. There's no sign anywhere in this essay that he ever wavers on this basic populationist position, that prosperity leads to growing population, and the two of these taken together can serve as our thermometer to measure the level of virtue in a civilization. So how do we encourage and ensure the virtue nutritive? What is the recipe? We find many examples of Botero's answer. For example, when complaining about societies that lack this virtue, he mentions things like, quote, a dearth, a famine, a war, an interruption of affairs and traffic, a deceit of merchants, and other such like, unquote. He also mentions thieves and robbers, and war actually shows up on his list several times. How do we avoid these threats to the virtue nutritive? On his last page, Botero finally mentions the twin pillars on which he believes an enlightened prince should build his city-state. These are peace, and justice. Peace prevents the waste of resources that comes from war, while justice deals with criminals and protects people's rights and property so that they can all work together without worrying about being taken advantage of by their neighbors. Botero's advice to a prince differs in this respect from the more amoral advice provided by his colleague Machiavelli. For Machiavelli, the only important thing was power, and whatever you need to do to gain more power, you should do it, without worrying about things like peace or justice. Botero's advice, built on a foundation of deeply held Catholic faith, insists that you can't maintain power if you abandon peace and justice. If you do follow his path, he believes that the result will be a growing and prosperous population, and this will lead straight to the greatness of your city. After you respond to the final questions about this article, you will be ready to move on to the next reading assignment.